Kalorama, a recorded books and Highbridge imprint, presents Disruption, the Senate During the Trump Era, edited by Sean M. Theriault, read by Perry Daniels and Dina Pearlman. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition you will hear references to figures, tables, and an appendix present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Introduction. Disruption, the Senate During the Trump Era, Frank H. Mackaman and Sean M. Theriault. The genesis for Disruption, the Senate During the Trump Era, occurred in December 2020 when C. Lawrence Evans, Newton Family Professor of Government at the College of William and Mary, posted a lengthy analysis on Facebook of the Senate floor exchange between Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer on potential votes for overriding a veto on a defense bill and the $2,000 stimulus proposal. In that particular moment, the interplay of the Senate and then-President Trump was at a critical moment. In the end, Congress overrode Trump's veto, the only one of his presidency. In a proposal to the Dirksen Congressional Center's Board of Directors, the one of us who at the time worked at the center argued that it will require sustained scholarly research to understand precisely the dynamics behind the Republican conference's machinations during the Trump presidency. The board subsequently approved an initial grant of $25,000 to the other one of us to put together a book on how the U.S. Senate evolved during the Trump presidency. The media coverage of Trump would leave the consumer with the perspective that everything changed either on the day Trump rode down the golden escalator at Trump Tower to announce his candidacy, June 16, 2015, on the day that Trump won the presidential contest, November 8, 2016, or on the day that he was sworn into office, January 20, 2017. No one doubts that Trump was cut from a different cloth than his predecessors. The media, though, offers only the first pass at history. The authors in this volume, some of whom come from the media, offer a more measured examination of Trump and the influence he had on an ever-evolving Senate. While the president may have been unique, the personalities in play may have been new, and the technologies and the strategies surrounding them may have been innovative. Some things persisted even in this new landscape. Let us emphasize one of these by historical example that bears repeating throughout this volume. Who leads matters. As the first session of the 86th Congress grew to a close in September 1959, Everett McKinley Dirksen, Republican, Illinois, the Senate's minority leader, dictated a letter to his counterpart, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Baines Johnson, Democrat, Texas. Dear Lyndon, Dirksen began, the end of the session is somewhat like the end of an act in a play. It marks but a fragment of time and brings not only reflection on what has transpired, but curiosity as to what lies ahead. Dirksen was about to complete his first term as his party's leader in the Senate. He had marshaled his beleaguered and outnumbered Republican troops, the Democrats held a 65-35 seat majority, to combat the Democrats in a series of legislative battles including housing bills, mutual security, rural electrification, and highway construction funding, U.S. participation in a new Inter-American Developmental Bank, and extension of the military draft. As Congressional Quarterly put it at the beginning of the session, there was no question that a partisan battle of panoramic scope was in store. In the end, CQ counted only two major accomplishments in the longest session since 1951, an act admitting statehood for Hawaii and a tough labor reform law, the Landrum-Griffin Act. Partisan gridlock, then as now, hampered legislative productivity. The party majorities split on 50% of the 1959 roll calls, up from 42% in 1958. The average Democratic member and the average Republican member voted with their party majority 75% of the time, and against it only 16% of the time. Despite their nearly 2-to-1 majorities in the House and Senate, the Democrats made only token progress toward the balance of their legislative goals. Similarly, they granted just 40% of President Dwight Eisenhower's requests. Dirksen acknowledged the fraught politics of the session in his missive to Johnson. "We have differed, but always with high respect for each other's viewpoint," he suggested. "We have fought, gently, I hope, but always with understanding. We have asserted our various party causes, but always in good grace." Dirksen concluded, "We have shared a high mutual pride in the Senate and in a common effort to make it and keep it what it is and always has been, the greatest free, independent, undominated legislative body in the world." Partisanship tempered by high respect, understanding, and grace, terms no one would use to describe the Senate during the Trump years. Johnson replied 2 days later, "Of the leaders with whom I have served, there have been none who can wield the partisan stiletto with quite the gusto and zest that you do." He then added, "But even though the stiletto cuts deep, it never stings." In his letter, Johnson recalled for Dirksen a lesson the Texan had learned as a neophyte in Congress. "I was told that no leader can be very useful unless he has friendships on the other side of the aisle." Dirksen agreed when he noted that our friendship has deepened and become a nourishing force in pursuing our respective duties. These private letters, never meant for publication, speak volumes about the relationship between these two leaders of competing political parties. Even as they disagreed, often pointedly, they respected one another, and they cherished their institution. Although the Senate was not particularly productive at that moment, Dirksen and Johnson were building a relationship that would bear much fruit before they both would leave Washington, D.C. The Dirksen-Johnson relationship proved enduring over the next decade as the two leaders worked together to pass landmark legislation during John Kennedy's New Frontier and Johnson's Great Society. In those cases, neither leader, even Johnson then as president, put partisan advantage over the national interest, a calculation few believe party leaders make today. Partisanship in 1959 looked nothing like the virulent political chauvinism that infects the Senate today. Now, the stiletto stings. Contrasting the Senate during the first year of Eisenhower's last Congress with the first year of the Trump administration shows how much the Senate has changed. In 2017, a majority of Republican senators opposed a majority of Democratic senators on 76.0% of the roll call votes, the highest percentage in CQ's 66 years of gathering the data. On those votes, Democrats voted with each other an average of 92% of the time, and Republicans voted with each other 97% of the time, which is also an all-time high. The next closest was 94% in 2003. While the Senate was embroiled in this partisan morass, it was not clear at all that Schumer and McConnell were exchanging private letters that would become the bedrock of a future Senate that would accomplish great legislation down the road. That the Senate changed from the Johnson-Dirksen era to the McConnell-Schumer era is not in doubt. Why the Senate changed and Donald Trump's role in that change is an entirely different question, and one that we take up in this volume. To answer the question of how much President Trump disrupted the Senate, we brought together what we think is the most diverse set of Senate observers ever assembled in an edited volume. Our authors range from former Senate staffers, Ritchie, Poirier, Bertram, and Wallner, to journalists, Lesniewski and Bellantoni, and historians, Mackaman, Ritchie, Crespino, and Zelizer, to political scientists, Theriault, Evans, Reynolds, Lee, Volden, Wiseman, Russell, Wallner, Howell, and Moe. What made this collaboration so fruitful was that all of the authors, while skilled in the tools of their own particular professions, appreciated the contributions made by those outside their field. The intermingling of the different professions started even before the collaboration on this project. One of the Senate staffers now has her desk in a university, and more than a few of the political scientists at one point collected paychecks from the federal government, when they worked in Congress. Another political scientist cut her teeth in politics at Congressional Quarterly, and a journalist has been the featured speaker at an academic conference. The chapters. Not unsurprisingly, such a learned, thoughtful, and conscientious group of scholars arrived at different answers. Donald Ritchie, who served in the Senate Historical Office from 1976 until he retired as the Senate historian in 2015, makes the important point that while the Senate has changed, the rules have not. As both parties transformed from having both liberal and conservative wings, majority parties reinterpreted the rules to achieve the goals that historical precedents would have forbidden. Because both parties engaged in this behavior before Trump's election in 2016, Ritchie argues that the Senate's behavior during the Trump administration was more a culmination than a disruption. In Chapter 2, Joseph Crespino, the Jimmy Carter Professor of History at Emory University, also looks to history to glean insight from the modern Senate. He explains that senators were disruptors far before Trump moved into the White House. By recounting Strom Thurmond's filibuster of the 1957 Civil Rights Bill, which remains the longest one-person speech in Senate history, Crespino argues that if senators of Thurmond's era had the individual powers of senators today, it is likely that far fewer of the landmark laws ever would have been enacted. C. Lawrence Evans takes us back even further, all the way back to the U.S. Constitution in Chapter 3. He argues that the disruption that we saw in the Senate during the Trump era is rooted in bicameralism. By analyzing the 2017 tax reform battle, he examines how the Trump administration used the structural incongruities grounded in apportionment and chamber procedures to disrupt the Senate. In Chapter 4, Molly Reynolds, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, examines how the Senate's long-standing trends in the legislative process interacted with an unpredictable president. She explains that the unorthodox lawmaking, which has long historical roots, became even more unorthodox. While she argues that much of what was on display during Trump's term was present before his election, his actions still drove the Senate's evolution in important ways. In the best example of the intermingling of professions, Francis Lee, a professor of political science at Princeton University, wrote a chapter with Bettina Poirier and Chris Bertram, who now both hang their hats in the program on legislative negotiation at American University. Prior to their current appointments, Poirier served many years in the Senate, including 10 years as the staff director and chief counsel for the Committee on Environment and Public Works, and Bertram worked for more than 30 years in the Senate, House, and Executive Branch, including a stint as Assistant Secretary of Transportation in the Obama administration. In their chapter, they discuss how a Democratic-led House, a Republican-led Senate, and the Trump White House came to pass a set of sweeping COVID aid measures on a wholly bipartisan basis. They draw on concepts from scholarship on negotiation to explain how agreements were reached on these massive legislative packages. In Chapter 6, Craig Volden, professor in the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia, and Alan Wiseman, the Cornelius Vanderbilt Chair in Political Science at Vanderbilt University, explain how Democratic senators achieved success even while they were both a minority party and a party opposite the president. The particular set of circumstances of the Trump White House, the Republican drive for judicial appointees, and the drive for solutions during the pandemic created the space for Democrats to achieve legislative success where few expected it. James Wallner, a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at Clemson University, and the former executive director of the Republican Senate Steering Committee, argues that rank-and-file senators empowered their party leaders to make nearly all the important decisions off the Senate floor, not only during the Trump years, but also before then and even after. As such, Trump did not have nearly the consequence in the Senate that many believe, including some of the other authors in this volume. In Chapter 8, Julian Zelizer, the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 1941 professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, argues that the uneasy personal relationship between President Trump and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell was made functional by their mutual desire to win at all costs. He argues that McConnell sacrificed the goals of governance and preserving democratic institutions on the altar of partisanship by weaponizing every conceivable process and norm to maintain legislative power. Niels Lesniewski, the chief correspondent for the White House and Congress at CQ Roll Call, documents the unprecedented actions Donald Trump took and discusses how few constraints the Senate put on him. He argues that the Senate often found itself either unequipped or uninterested in responding to Trump's pushing of the envelope. In Chapter 10, Annalise Russell, an assistant professor at the Martin School of Public Policy and Administration at the University of Kentucky, who cut her political teeth at Congressional Quarterly before going to graduate school, examines how Senate communication strategies were transformed by growing dependence upon Twitter and Trump's use of the platform. She explains how senators adapted to the Twitter environment, where news is always being made, and Trump made misinformation common and facts debatable. She argues Trump was an accelerant, speeding the development of a combustible communication climate rather than the creator of it. Lee Drutman, senior fellow in the Political Reform Program at New America, takes a step back in examining the Senate's legitimacy crisis. He argues that the Senate no longer serves as the second sober thought that the founders envisioned. Even as democracies around the globe are curtailing the powers of their upper chambers, the Senate continues to flex its powers, and the gridlock it imposes on the entire system will likely persist for the foreseeable future. In Chapter 12, Christina Bellantoni, the director of the Annenberg Media Center at the University of Southern California, and formerly the political editor at the PBS NewsHour and editor-in-chief at Roll Call, wears both her journalist and academic hat in documenting how the Senate has changed since she started her career in Washington, D.C. In the end, she argues that many of the fibers that kept the institutional fabric of the Senate together were cut during the Trump years. The final substantive chapter showcases presidency scholars William Howell, the Sidney Stein Professor of American Politics at the University of Chicago, and Terry M. Moe, William Bennett Monroe Professor of Political Science at Stanford University, putting the Senate into the broader American political system context. They chronicle the many unilateral actions Trump took in the face of congressional disinterest, dysfunction, and even opposition. They argue that Congress's own pathologies often make legislators incapable of overturning any presidential action, even those with which they vehemently disagree. In the conclusion, one of us assesses the Senate since Trump moved out of the White House. It is clear that the Senate has not snapped back to its pre-Trump contours, but rather continues to wrestle with the norms, rules, and procedures disrupted by Trump's 4 years in the White House. Perhaps the hangover is made more severe as Trump still dominates the coverage in news cycle after news cycle. The lessons. All the authors agree that Trump mattered, though they might heartily disagree over the extent to which he mattered. Over the development of this book, we argued in person at a one-day conference hosted by the Kluge Center in the Library of Congress and at 2 panels in professional conferences. Those arguments continued over several nice dinners and in email threads that connected us even over distance and time. While the varying perspectives vindicated the Dirksen Center's board in seeking an examination of this subject and the collection of perspectives that one of us assembled, the team of authors in this volume are more unified in arguing that Trump mattered than they are divided in how much he mattered. Beyond the explicit question of analyzing, measuring, and arguing about Trump's disruption, the authors weave through their various chapters 4 prevalent themes. First, the Senate matters. To each of the authors, the Senate is more than just a second chamber of the legislative branch. It is the one institution in the national government with compromise written into its rules. While the president can change policy with the stroke of his pen, and a unified majority in the House can pass legislation on a party line vote, the Senate requires support from both parties in all but the rarest of circumstances. As James Madison, though himself never a senator, said at the Constitutional Convention, the use of the Senate is to consist in its proceedings with more coolness, with more system, and with more wisdom than the House of Representatives. So the authors, admittedly with varying degrees, recognize the uniqueness and peculiarities of the Senate. Drutman argues that ultimately the Senate mattering could be, and in his opinion should be, the Senate's downfall. While Howell and Moe think the Senate's peculiarities undermine its relevance, Bellantoni and Ritchie suggest that these features are what make the Senate so interesting and so important. Second, history matters. None of the authors think that the Senate changed only because of President Trump. What precedes his victory in the 2016 election, and perhaps even what caused it, has its roots at least as far back as the politics of Strom Thurmond, Crespino, or even the Constitution, Evans. Wallner might say that Obama almost seamlessly handed off the baton to Trump in understanding the effect that presidents can have. Without dissent, all the authors recognize that what came before Trump in the Republican Party, Zelizer and Russell, and in the Senate, Bellantoni, shaped the impact he had on how it operated during his 4 years in the White House. Third, rules matter. While the Senate rules were unchanged under Trump, Ritchie, the manner and frequency with which they were used and abused did change, Reynolds and Lesniewski, though not always for obstructionism, Volden and Wiseman, and Lee, Poirier, and Bertram. Senate rules can constrain behavior, but they do not force any one set of actions. Rather, they permit a range that can be influenced by those like the Senate Democrats inside the chamber, Volden and Wiseman, or like Trump outside the chamber, Russell and Bellantoni. Fourth, who leads matters. Whether being led by the great triumvirate, John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster, and Henry Clay, Czar Thomas Reed, the Senate 4, Nelson Aldrich, William Allison, Orville Platt, and John Spooner, Johnson and Dirksen, or McConnell and Schumer, leaders have discretion in the actions they take. Lyndon Johnson's leadership in the Senate during the Eisenhower administration made a difference, as did his relationship with Everett Dirksen during his own. And so it is the case with Mitch McConnell during the Trump administration and his relationship with Chuck Schumer. While the authors may disagree about how leadership mattered and the extent to which it mattered, no author doubts that the combination of Trump, McConnell, Schumer produced different outcomes than some other set of leaders. At the same time, no author is naive enough to think that any two-party leaders in today's Senate could mirror the mutual affection between Dirksen and Johnson if they wanted to stay on the job. In today's Senate, indeed, the stiletto stings because a sufficient number of senators in both parties demand that it do so. We hope that the listeners of this volume find answers to their questions about how the Senate operates today, while providing some evidence and arguments for those questions that remain open. 1. The Changing Senate's Unchanging Rules. Donald A. Ritchie. Introduction. The U.S. Senate during the presidencies of Donald Trump and Joseph Biden bears little resemblance to the institution that Biden joined in 1973. Then there were no women senators, nor women staff in prominent positions, and few minorities. The Senate's chief computer was collectively reserved for mass mailings. Reporters in the press gallery still telegraphed their stories to their newspapers. No television cameras recorded debates in the Senate chamber. Campaign finance laws regulated and limited contributions to candidates. The Senate met 5 days a week and on an occasional Saturday. 6-year terms encouraged senators to move their families to Washington for the months that Congress was in session, providing opportunities to socialize with each other during off hours. A half-century later, a quarter of the senators were women and minorities held key staff positions. Digital electronics dominated office work, communications, and the media. Television lights brightened the Senate chamber from twilight to high noon. The Supreme Court had disabled most campaign finance restrictions, interpreting monetary contributions as a form of free speech, and causing senators to engage in perpetual fundraising. The congressional work week shrank to Tuesdays through Thursdays, and more members left their families back in their home states, providing less time and opportunity to legislate or socialize. Politically, the Senate underwent an even more sweeping transformation. Biden first took his seat in an institution that Democrats had controlled for 36 of the previous 40 years. Most senators from the South were Democrats, among them the arch-conservative James Eastland of Mississippi. Senate Republicans included such ardent liberals as Jacob Javits of New York. Both parties were internally divided between their liberal and conservative wings, which created what political scientists have described as four-party politics. Liberals would join forces against conservatives, with both sides vying for those in the middle. Almost all votes were bipartisan. A straight party line vote would have made headlines. Over the next 5 decades, Democrats and Republicans split control of the Senate equally, with the majority switching back and forth about every 6 years. The South seceded from the Democratic Party, and conservative Republicans expelled liberals as rhinos, Republican in name only. As conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans traded party affiliations, the reshuffling created unprecedented levels of unity within the congressional party conferences, whose members began voting together more than 90% of the time. Bipartisan votes now made headlines. During the four-party era, shifting coalitions prompted compromise and cooperation, but internal cohesion has removed much of the party's incentive to work together. Instead of needing to pacify dissident factions, the leader of a united conference could focus on a common adversary, the other party. Minority parties aimed to win back control in the next election, and unless the issue was of transcendent nature, they saw little reward in bipartisan collaboration. The only significant part of the Senate that had not changed was its standing rules. Business as usual was highly unlikely after such a dramatic shake-up of the political parties, and recent majority leaders have had to struggle to keep the institution functioning. The Senate rule that has caused the most anguish and generated the most calls for reform concerns cloture, the mechanism for ending debate and permitting a vote. The history of Senate treatment of filibusters and cloture reflects the difficulty in changing the formal rules and reveals the alternative tactics that leaders have employed. The Constitution authorizes each chamber of Congress to write its own rules, the Senate and House operating under similar rules, but the larger House gradually adjusting its procedures to permit a majority to act more efficiently. It has always been easier for the House to revise its rules, since its entire membership stands for election every 2 years. Newly elected majorities can adopt whatever rules suit their purposes. By contrast, since only a third of the senators run in each election, a quorum always carries over into the next Congress. The Senate has therefore defined itself as a continuing body that does not revise its rules at the beginning of each Congress. The Senate Rules. In its more than 2 centuries of operation, the U.S. Senate has conducted only 7 general revisions of its rules, the last taking place between 1979 and 1983. Technically, a simple majority can rewrite the rules, but since revisions are debatable, it takes a 2/3 vote to cut off debate, which means that substantial rule changes can occur only after a broad bipartisan consensus has been reached. The rules have traditionally given more muscle to the minority, which in the Senate can be the minority party, a faction within either party, or a single senator. These rules better fit the compromise-seeking, coalition-building, log-rolling, horse-trading days of the past than they do the polarized politics of the present. As the Senate grew polarized, minority parties repeatedly and effectively employed the standing rules to impede the majority. Such recalcitrance prompted the majority to devise creative efforts to enable Senate business to proceed. While the Senate's rules remain...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?